The morning mist clung to the Dakota plains like ghostly fingers, carrying whispers of a destiny that would shake the foundations of two worlds. In the shadows of the Black Hills, where ancient spirits dwelled and eagles soared on sacred winds, a story was about to unfold that would challenge everything known about power, honor, and the courage to kneel before truth. What happened next would transform a feared warrior chief into something the plains had never seen before, and turn a captive woman's terror into the most unlikely triumph of the human spirit. This is the story of how the mightiest can become the humblest, and how love can conquer even the deepest wounds of war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special. For you, the attack came with the dawn, swift and merciless as lightning across the Montana Territory. Rebecca Coleman pressed herself against the rough wooden floor of her family's cabin, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain the raiders outside could hear it through the walls. The sound of hoofbeats thundered past the window like a stampede of buffalo, mixed with war cries that seemed to tear the very air apart. She had been making breakfast when the first shots rang out. Coffee still steamed in the tin pot on the stove, and eggs lay scattered across the floor where she had dropped them in her haste to take cover. Through the gaps in the shutters, she could see smoke rising from the neighboring homesteads, dark columns against the pale morning sky that told stories she did not want to imagine. Rebecca was not supposed to be here alone. Her husband James had ridden to Fort Peterson 3 days ago to report rustlers in the area, promising to return before sunset. That had been 72 hours ago, and with each passing hour, Rebecca's worry had grown like a thorny vine around her chest. Now as bullets splintered the wood above her head, she wondered if she would ever see his gentle face again. The 24-year-old schoolteacher from Illinois had never imagined her life would lead to this moment. When she and James had answered the call for settlers to help civilize the Montana frontier, they had pictured a peaceful existence teaching children and building a community. The reality had been far harsher than any government pamphlet had suggested. Winters that could kill, with cold, summers that scorched the earth to dust, and now this violence that seemed to erupt from nowhere like prairie fire. Outside, she could hear voices calling to each other in a language she did not understand. The words were sharp and urgent, filled with authority that made her skin crawl with fear. These were not random bandits or desperate men driven to crime by hardship. These were warriors, organized and purposeful, moving with the precision of those who had mastered the art of war. Rebecca closed her eyes and tried to remember the prayers her mother had taught her as a child in Chicago. The words felt hollow in her mouth, overwhelmed by the thunder of her own pulse and the acrid smell of gunpowder that seeped through the cabin walls. She had always believed that God protected the innocent, but lying here in the dust and shadows, she wondered if innocence was nothing more than a luxury the frontier could not afford. The sound of splintering wood made her eyes snap open. The front door, which James had reinforced with iron bars after hearing stories from other settlers, was giving way under repeated blows. Each impact sent vibrations through the floor beneath her, and Rebecca realized with growing horror that her hiding place would not protect her much longer. She thought of the small derringer James had insisted she keep in the kitchen drawer, but it lay somewhere across the room, as unreachable as the moon. Even if she could get to it, Rebecca had never fired a gun at another human being. The idea of taking a life, even in self-defense, went against everything she had been raised to believe. Yet as the door buckled under another assault, she found herself wishing she had overcome those scruples long ago. A final blow sent the door crashing inward, followed by the heavy footsteps of men entering her sanctuary. Rebecca held her breath and pressed herself flatter against the floor, hoping the overturned table might conceal her for a few precious seconds longer. Through the chaos of racing thoughts, she tried to plan her next move, But terror had turned her mind to molasses, slow and thick and useless. The footsteps moved through the cabin with deliberate care, and Rebecca could hear objects being shifted and examined. They were searching for something or someone. Her hiding place would not hold for long against a systematic search, and she knew that discovery was inevitable. The only question was whether she should surrender now or force them to find her cowering like a wounded animal. The decision was made for her when rough hands seized her shoulders and dragged her from beneath the table. Rebecca found herself staring up into a face that belonged in her worst nightmares. The warrior who held her was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to block out the sun streaming through the broken doorway. His chest was bare, except for an intricate breastplate made of bone and leather, decorated with symbols that spoke of battles won and enemies defeated. But it was his face that truly terrified her. Not because it was cruel or savage, as she had expected, but because it was so utterly controlled. His features could have been carved from granite, showing no emotion beyond a cold assessment that seemed to measure her worth in seconds. His eyes were dark as winter nights, framed by high cheekbones and a jawline that suggested both nobility and absolute ruthlessness. War paint streaked his face in patterns of black and red, and his long hair was decorated with feathers and beads that caught the morning light as he moved. This was no ordinary raider or desperate outlaw. This was a chief, a leader of men, someone who commanded respect and obedience with nothing more than his presence. When he spoke, his voice was like distant thunder, deep and resonant, with an accent that made each English word sound carefully chosen. "You will come with us," he said simply, as if her compliance was already assumed. There was no threat in his tone, no cruel promise of what would happen if she refused. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The statement was delivered as a fact, like announcing the sunrise or the change of seasons. Rebecca wanted to protest, to demand explanations or plead for mercy, but the words died in her throat when she looked into those implacable eyes. She had heard stories about what happened to women taken by Indian war parties, whispered tales that respectable people did not discuss in polite company. The images that filled her mind made her stomach turn, but she forced herself to meet his gaze with as much dignity as she could muster. "My husband will come looking for me," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. It was a lie, or at least she hoped it was. If James returned to find the homestead destroyed and her gone, he would either assume she was dead or mount a rescue attempt that would likely get him killed. Neither option offered much comfort. The giant warrior studied her for a long moment, and Rebecca thought she saw something flicker in his dark eyes. It might have been amusement or respect or simple curiosity about this small white woman who dared to speak to him without begging for mercy. When he finally responded, his words carried a weight that suggested deeper meaning. "Many husbands have come looking," he said quietly. "Few have found what they sought." 2 other warriors entered the cabin behind their leader, both smaller but no less dangerous looking. They spoke to him in rapid phrases of their native tongue, gesturing toward the door with obvious urgency. Rebecca caught the word "soldiers" repeated several times and realized that their attack had not gone unnoticed. Somewhere in the distance, help might be coming, though whether it would arrive in time to matter was another question entirely. The chief listened to his men's report, without taking his eyes off Rebecca, then nodded once in acknowledgement. When he turned back to her, there was something different in his expression, though she could not identify what had changed. "We leave now," he announced, reaching down to pull Rebecca to her feet with surprising gentleness. His hand was enormous, easily encompassing her wrist, but his grip was careful not to bruise or injure. For a man who could clearly break her in half without effort, his touch showed an unexpected consideration that confused her more than outright brutality would have. Rebecca found herself being led outside into a scene that would haunt her dreams for years to come. The settlement that had been her home for 2 years lay in ruins, with smoke rising from half a dozen buildings and the acrid smell of burned wood heavy in the air. Bodies lay scattered in the dust, neighbors she had known and taught their children, now still and silent under the merciless morning sun. She wanted to stop, to mourn, to offer some prayer or gesture of respect for the dead, but the chief's hand on her shoulder guided her forward with implacable purpose. A magnificent horse waited nearby, a stallion as black as midnight with eyes that seemed to hold intelligence far beyond any animal she had ever seen. The chief mounted in one fluid motion, then reached down to pull Rebecca up behind him. As they rode away from the destroyed settlement, Rebecca caught sight of dust clouds on the eastern horizon that marked the approach of cavalry from Fort Peterson. The rescue that might have saved her was perhaps an hour away, close enough to see but too far to matter. She closed her eyes and tried not to think about James finding the ruins of their life together, tried not to imagine his grief and rage when he realized she was gone. The war party moved with practiced efficiency across the rough terrain, following trails that were invisible to Rebecca's untrained eyes, but clearly familiar to her captors. The chief rode with the easy grace of someone who had spent his life in the saddle, and despite her terror, Rebecca found herself oddly secure behind him. His broad back blocked the wind, and his steady breathing became a rhythm that helped calm her racing heart. They rode in silence for what felt like hours, the only sounds the drumming of hooves against hard earth and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. Rebecca tried to memorize the landscape they passed through, hoping against hope that she might someday need to find her way back. But the rolling hills and scattered groves of cottonwood trees all looked alike to her. City-trained eyes. It was near midday when they finally stopped to rest beside a small stream that meandered through a valley she had never seen before. The chief dismounted and helped Rebecca down with the same careful courtesy he had shown earlier, then gestured toward the water with one hand. "Drink," he said simply. "We have far to go." Rebecca knelt by the stream and cupped the cold water in her hands, grateful for the chance to wash the dust from her throat and gather her scattered thoughts. The water was crystal clear and tasted of snow from distant mountains, reminding her that they were traveling deeper into wilderness with each passing mile. When she looked up, she found the chief watching her with an expression she could not read. He had removed his war paint while she drank, revealing features that were both proud and surprisingly thoughtful. Without the intimidating paint, he looked younger than she had first assumed, perhaps only a few years older than herself. "What is your name?" he asked suddenly, the question catching her off guard. "Rebecca," she replied automatically then. Immediately wondered if giving him that information had been a mistake. "Rebecca Coleman." He nodded as if filing the information away for future use. "I am called Dakota," he said after a moment's consideration. "In your language, it means friend to all." The irony of the translation was not lost on Rebecca, and she must have shown her skepticism because something that might have been a smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Names do not always match the man who carries them," he observed quietly. "Sometimes they are wishes, sometimes they are warnings. Sometimes they are burdens we bear until we can become worthy of them." Rebecca found herself staring at this unexpected glimpse of philosophy from a man she had assumed was nothing more than a savage killer. Everything about this situation challenged her preconceptions, from his careful treatment of her to his fluent English to the thoughtful way he spoke about identity and purpose. "Why did you take me?" she asked, the question bursting out before she could stop herself. "Why not just kill me with the others?" Dakota was quiet for so long that Rebecca began to think he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that suggested they revealed more than he had intended. "Because sometimes the spirits speak through our enemies," he said slowly. "And sometimes what appears to be capture is actually rescue." Before Rebecca could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, the sound of approaching horses announced the return of his scouts. They spoke to him urgently in their own language, and Rebecca saw his expression grow serious as he listened. To their report. "Mount up," he told her, his tone becoming businesslike again. "The soldiers are closer than expected, and we must reach the sacred hills before dark." As they prepared to resume their journey, Rebecca found herself looking back toward the horizon where her old life lay in ashes. She had no idea what awaited her in the sacred hills or why this fierce warrior chief had chosen to spare her, when he had shown no mercy to anyone else. All she knew was that her world had changed forever in the space of a few hours, and that the man who held her fate in his hands was far more complex than any of the stories she had heard about Indian raiders. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as they continued their trek across the endless plains, and Rebecca found herself wondering if she would live to see another sunset. But as Dakota's steady presence at her back and the rhythmic motion of the horse began to lull her into an exhausted daze, she realized that for the first time since the attack began, she was no longer afraid. Whether that was wisdom or simply shock, she could not say. But as they rode deeper into the heart of Lakota territory, Rebecca Coleman began to suspect that her capture might be the beginning of something far stranger and more significant than either rescue or death. The sacred hills rose before them like sleeping giants, and somewhere in their shadows waited answers to questions she had not yet learned to ask. The sun had begun its descent toward the western peaks when Rebecca first glimpsed the sacred hills that Chief Dakota had spoken of. They rose from the plains like ancient sentinels, their slopes covered in dense pine forests that seemed to whisper secrets in the evening breeze. Somewhere in those mysterious depths lay answers that Rebecca desperately needed, though she had no idea what questions to ask. As their horses picked their way up a narrow trail that seemed barely wide enough for single-file passage, Rebecca found herself pressed even closer against Dakota's broad back. The warmth of his body was oddly comforting despite the circumstances, and she had noticed that whenever the path became treacherous, he would subtly shift his weight to protect her from potential falls. For a man who had destroyed her entire world in a single morning, he showed a consideration that made no sense to her civilized mind. The trail wound upward through stands of aspen whose leaves shimmered like coins in the fading light. Rebecca had never seen country so wild and beautiful, so untouched by the hand of civilization that had been slowly creeping across the continent. Every breath of the thin mountain air seemed to carry the scent of pine and wildflowers, mixed with something else she could not identify, but that spoke to her soul of ancient mysteries and timeless wisdom. When they finally crested a ridge and began descending into a hidden valley, Rebecca gasped at the sight that greeted her. Spread across the valley floor was an Indian village unlike anything she had ever imagined. Dozens of tipis arranged in careful circles, their painted hides glowing like jewels in the sunset light. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and she could see people moving about their evening activities with the easy grace of those who lived in perfect harmony with their surroundings. But it was the size and obvious prosperity of the village that truly shocked her. This was no ragged band of desperate raiders living on the margins of survival. These people were clearly thriving, their tipis large and well-maintained, their horses numerous and healthy, their children playing games that echoed with laughter across the valley. Everything about the scene spoke of a civilization that was ancient, sophisticated, and completely self-sufficient. Dakota must have felt her surprise because he turned slightly in the saddle to gauge her reaction. "Not what you expected?" he asked, and Rebecca thought she heard amusement in his deep voice. "No," she admitted honestly. "I was told that Indians lived in poverty and squalor, barely surviving from day to day." "Many of your people believe many things that are not true," Dakota replied quietly. "Just as many of my people believe things about whites that prove false when we actually meet them." As they descended into the village, Rebecca became aware that their arrival was causing quite a stir. People emerged from their tipis to watch the procession, and she could see children running ahead to announce their approach. The attention made her acutely self-conscious, particularly since she was still wearing her simple calico dress that was now torn and dusty from the day's journey. But what struck her most was the absence of hostility in the faces that watched her pass. She had expected anger, hatred, perhaps cruel amusement at seeing a white captive brought into their midst. Instead, she saw curiosity, concern, and something that looked remarkably like sympathy. These people were looking at her as if she were a refugee rather than an enemy, and the realization made her question everything she thought she knew about the relationship between whites and Indians. Their horses were met by a group of young warriors who took charge of the animals with respectful efficiency. Rebecca noticed that each of these men treated Dakota with obvious deference, but not the fearful submission she might have expected toward a tyrant. Instead, their behavior suggested genuine respect and affection for a leader they trusted completely. Dakota dismounted and helped Rebecca down with his characteristic careful courtesy, then gestured toward the largest tipi in the village. It was easily 3 times the size of any of the others, decorated with intricate paintings that seemed to tell complex stories in vivid colors and symbols. Unlike the crude dwellings Rebecca had imagined, this structure was clearly the product of master craftsmen, as elegant and sophisticated as any building she had seen in Chicago. "You will stay with my sister while you are here," Dakota announced, surprising Rebecca with both the information and the matter-of-fact way he delivered it. "She will help you understand our ways and decide what path your future will take." "My future?" Rebecca asked, confusion clear in her voice. "I thought I was a prisoner." Dakota studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable in the growing twilight. "Prisoners are kept against their will," he said slowly. "Guests are free to choose their own destiny. Which you are depends entirely on you." Before Rebecca could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, a woman emerged from the large tipi and approached them with quick, graceful steps. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with the same high cheekbones and intelligent eyes as Dakota, but where his presence was imposing and somewhat intimidating, hers radiated warmth and gentle strength. She was dressed in beautiful buckskin clothing, decorated with intricate beadwork in shades of blue and white that caught the firelight like captured stars. Her long hair was braided with small silver ornaments that chimed softly as she moved, and around her neck hung a necklace of turquoise and bone that spoke of both artistic skill and spiritual significance. When she spoke, her English was as fluent as her brother's, but carried a musical quality that made even simple words sound like poetry. "Welcome to our village," she said to Rebecca, her voice warm with genuine kindness. "I am Ayanna, and you are safe here." The simple declaration hit Rebecca harder than she had expected. Safe. When was the last time she had truly felt safe? Not since leaving Illinois, certainly. Perhaps not since childhood, when the world had seemed predictable and secure. But looking into Ayanna's gentle eyes, Rebecca found herself believing that this stranger meant exactly what she said. "Thank you," Rebecca managed to say, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what was being offered to her. Ayanna smiled and took Rebecca's hand in her own, and Rebecca was struck by the softness of her skin, despite the obvious strength in her grip. "You have had a difficult day," Ayanna said sympathetically. "Come, we will get you cleaned up and fed, and then we can talk about whatever questions you carry." As Ayanna led her toward the tipi, Rebecca looked back to see Dakota watching them, with an expression she could not read. There was something in his gaze that made her think of longing, though she could not imagine what a powerful chief like him might long for that he did not already possess. The interior of Ayanna's tipi was a revelation. Rich furs covered the floor, and beautiful tapestries hung from the walls depicting scenes of buffalo hunts, spiritual ceremonies, and historical events that Rebecca wished she could understand. A small fire burned in the center of the space, its smoke rising through an opening at the top that had been designed with engineering precision to prevent downdrafts. Everything about the dwelling spoke of comfort, beauty, and sophisticated understanding of both practical and aesthetic needs. Ayanna gestured for Rebecca to sit on a pile of soft furs near the fire, then began heating water in a beautifully crafted pot. "First, we tend to your body," she explained. "Then we can tend to your spirit, which I suspect has been more damaged than your flesh." As Ayanna prepared a simple meal of roasted meat, wild vegetables, and something that tasted like sweetened cornbread, Rebecca found herself studying her hostess with growing fascination. Everything about this woman challenged the stereotypes Rebecca had carried in her mind about Indian women. Ayanna was clearly educated, articulate, and sophisticated, but she was also obviously proud of her heritage and completely comfortable in her traditional surroundings. "How do you speak English?" "So well?" Rebecca asked when curiosity finally overcame her caution. Ayanna smiled as she handed Rebecca a wooden bowl filled with the aromatic stew. "Traders have been coming to our village for many years," she explained. "Some stayed long enough to teach us their language in exchange for learning ours. My brother and I found that we had a gift for languages, and our father encouraged us to develop that skill." "Your father?" "Chief Mop," Ayanna said with obvious pride. "He believes that understanding leads to peace, and peace is always preferable to war, even when war seems inevitable." Rebecca nearly choked on the piece of meat she was chewing. "Chief Mop is your father? Then that makes Dakota the heir to leadership of our band," Ayanna confirmed, "though he has not yet chosen to accept that responsibility fully. He believes he has not yet proven himself worthy of the trust our people would place in him." This information hit Rebecca like a physical blow. The man who had destroyed her settlement and taken her captive was not just some war chief or ambitious warrior. He was the son of one of the most powerful leaders in the entire region, a man whose decisions could affect the lives of thousands of people. The implications of that fact made her head spin with new possibilities and new fears. "Why did he attack our settlement?" Rebecca asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since morning finally finding voice. "We had done nothing to provoke such violence." Ayanna's expression grew serious, and Rebecca saw shadows of old pain flicker across her features. "3 weeks ago, soldiers from your Fort Peterson attacked a group of our young men who were hunting buffalo on land that treaties guaranteed to us," she said quietly. 4 of our warriors were killed, including Dakota's closest friend since childhood. The soldiers claimed they thought the hunting party was a war band preparing to attack settlers. Rebecca felt her stomach drop as she began to understand the sequence of events that had led to the morning's violence. "So the attack on our settlement was revenge?" "Justice," Ayanna corrected gently. "In our culture, when innocent blood is spilled, it must be balanced or the spirits will not rest. Dakota chose your settlement because intelligence suggested that some of the men there had been among those who celebrated the killing of our hunters." The words hit Rebecca like cold water. She thought of her neighbors, the men she had known as friends and fellow pioneers, and wondered which of them might have been involved in the incident Ayanna described. Had James known about it? Had he approved? The possibility that her husband might have been complicit in the deaths of innocent people made her feel sick. "But why spare me?" Rebecca asked, though she was not sure she wanted to know the answer. Ayanna studied her for a long moment before responding. "Because Dakota recognized something in you that reminded him of his own mother," she said softly. "She was captured by white soldiers when she was young, but instead of being rescued by her people, she chose to stay and marry the officer who had taken her. She became a bridge between our worlds, helping to negotiate treaties and prevent conflicts." Rebecca stared at Ayanna in shock. "Dakota's mother was white?" "Half white," Ayanna clarified. "Her mother was Lakota, but her father was a French trader." She understood both cultures, and that understanding made her valuable to everyone. Until she was killed by whites who thought she was betraying them. By working for peace. The tragic story explains so much about Dakota's complex attitude toward her. He was not simply a warrior seeking revenge, but a man carrying the burden of a family history that bridged two worlds in conflict. His mother's death had clearly shaped his view of the relationship between whites and Indians. Yet something in Rebecca had reminded him of the woman who had tried to build peace rather than perpetuate war. What happened to her? Rebecca asked. Softly. She was visiting a settlement to arrange for the return of some stolen horses when raiders attacked. Ayanna explained, her voice heavy with old grief. The settlers thought she was part of the raiding party and shot her before they realized she was there to help them. She died trying to explain that she came in peace. Rebecca closed her eyes and tried to imagine the horror of that scene. A woman working for peace, killed by the very people she was trying to protect. The tragedy of it made her heart ache, and she began to understand why. Dakota's eyes sometimes held such profound sadness despite his obvious strength. How old was Dakota when it happened? 15, Ayanna replied. Old enough to understand what he had lost, but too young to process the injustice of it all. He spent years after that believing that peace between our peoples was impossible, that violence was the only language. Whites understood. Rebecca looked around the beautiful teepee, thinking about the sophisticated village outside and the complex family dynamics she was beginning to understand. But something changed his mind, Ayanna smiled mysteriously. Someone changed his mind, or began to, anyway. That process is still continuing. Before Rebecca could ask what she meant by that cryptic comment, the sound of approaching footsteps announced a visitor. Dakota's deep voice called out in Lakota, asking permission to enter, and Ayanna responded with what sounded like an affirmative. The chief ducked through the entrance, having to bend considerably to fit his impressive frame through the opening. In the firelight, wearing traditional clothing instead of war paint, he looked less like the terrifying warrior who had captured her, and more like what he actually was, a young man carrying enormous responsibilities on his broad shoulders. He spoke to his sister in rapid Lakota, and Rebecca caught her own name mentioned several times in the conversation. Ayanna responded with what sounded like questions or perhaps gentle arguments, and Rebecca got the impression that they were discussing her future in terms she did not yet understand. Finally, Dakota turned his attention to Rebecca, and she was struck once again by the intelligence and complexity she saw in his dark eyes. "My sister tells me she has begun to explain some of our history to you," he said in his careful English. "Some of it," Rebecca agreed. "I'm beginning to understand that the situation is more complicated than I realized." Something that might have been approval flickered across Dakota's features. "Complications are the beginning of wisdom," he observed. "Simple answers are usually wrong answers." He settled onto the furs across the fire from Rebecca, moving with the fluid grace that seemed to characterize everything he did. In the dancing firelight, she could study his face more carefully than she had been able to during their long ride. Without the intimidating war paint, his features were noble rather than frightening, marked by the kind of quiet strength that inspired loyalty rather than fear. "What happens to me now?" Rebecca asked, the question that had been building in her mind all evening finally finding voice. Dakota exchanged glances with his sister before answering. "That depends entirely on what you choose to happen," he said. Slowly, "Tomorrow, our father will want to meet you and hear your story. After that, you will have decisions to make." "What kind of decisions?" "Whether you wish to return to your people," Dakota said simply. "Whether you wish to stay with ours. Whether you wish to help us find a path between war and peace that does not require more innocent blood to be spilled." Rebecca felt overwhelmed by the weight of such choices. A day ago, her biggest decision had been what to prepare for dinner. Now she was being asked to choose between entire ways of life, perhaps between war and peace for thousands of people. "I don't understand why my choice would matter to anyone," she said honestly. "I'm nobody important. Just a schoolteacher from Illinois." Dakota leaned forward slightly, his intense gaze fixed on her face. "Teachers are among the most important people in any society," he said seriously. "They shape minds and hearts. They determine what the next generation will believe about the world and their place in it. But I'm just one person. One person with the right words at the right time can change the course of history," Ayanna added gently. "Our grandmother always said that the spirits work through individuals who are willing to listen to wisdom rather than prejudice." Rebecca thought about that as she finished her meal. The food was delicious, more flavorful than anything she had eaten in months, and she realized how much she had missed the simple pleasure of a well-prepared meal shared with people who cared about her comfort. As the evening deepened and the fire burned lower, the conversation turned to lighter topics. Ayanna asked about Rebecca's life before coming west, and Rebecca found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Chicago, her work as a teacher, and her dreams of helping to build schools and communities on the frontier. In return, she learned about Lakota traditions, about the spiritual beliefs that guided their decisions, and about the complex social structures that governed their interactions with each other and with the natural world. What struck Rebecca most was how similar their core values were, despite the vast differences in their cultures. Both peoples valued courage, honesty, loyalty to family, and protection of the innocent. Both believed in the importance of education, though they defined it differently. Both struggled with the question of how to maintain their traditions while adapting to a rapidly changing world. "Your people and mine are not as different as we have been led to believe," Rebecca observed as the conversation wound down. "No," Dakota agreed quietly. "But difference has been more profitable than similarity for those who benefit from conflict." The comment carried implications that Rebecca was only beginning to understand. Someone was profiting from the violence between whites and Indians, and those someones had good reasons to prevent peace from breaking out. The realization made her think about her own situation in an entirely new light. When Ayanna began preparing a sleeping area for Rebecca, spreading soft furs and arranging pillows with obvious care, Rebecca realized how exhausted she was. The day had been filled with more emotional and physical shocks than she had experienced in her entire previous life, and her body was finally demanding rest. As she settled into the surprisingly comfortable bed, Rebecca found herself thinking about the choices that awaited her. Return to her old life, assuming James was still alive and willing to take her back after her time with the Indians. Stay with the Lakota and try to build a new life among people who had shown her more kindness in one day than some of her own neighbors had shown in 2 years. Or somehow find a way to bridge the gap between the two worlds, following in the footsteps of Dakota's mother despite the tragic end that woman had met. Each option carried risks and possibilities that she could barely begin to evaluate. But as she drifted toward sleep, listening to the gentle sounds of the village settling down for the night, Rebecca realized that for the first time since leaving Illinois, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new choices. But tonight, surrounded by the warmth and safety of Ayanna's tipi, Rebecca Coleman slept more peacefully than she had in months, dreaming of bridges built from understanding rather than walls built from fear. Dawn came slowly to the hidden valley, painting the eastern peaks in shades of rose and gold that seemed to set the very air on fire. Rebecca woke to the sound of birdsong and the gentle crackling of a freshly built fire, finding herself more rested than she had been in months despite the strange circumstances of her sleep. The soft furs beneath her body had provided better comfort than her own bed back at the homestead, and the clean mountain air had cleared her lungs of the dust and smoke that seemed to perpetually hang over the frontier settlements. Ayanna was already awake, moving quietly around the tipi as she prepared what appeared to be a morning meal. The Lakota woman moved with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in her environment, every gesture economical and purposeful. She had changed from her elaborate dress of the previous evening into simpler working clothes, but even these everyday garments showed the exquisite craftsmanship that seemed to characterize everything in the village. "Good morning," Ayanna said softly when she noticed Rebecca stirring. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in a very long time," Rebecca admitted, sitting up and stretching muscles that felt surprisingly relaxed despite the previous days. "Ordeal. Thank you for your kindness." Ayanna smiled warmly as she ladled something that smelled like honey and grain into a wooden bowl. "Kindness given returns kindness received," she said, offering the bowl to Rebecca. "Our grandmother always said that the circle of generosity makes the whole world stronger." The breakfast was unlike anything Rebecca had ever tasted, a mixture of ground corn, wild berries, and what she suspected was maple syrup, all combined into something that was both nourishing and delicious. As she ate, she became aware of sounds from outside the tipi that suggested the village was awakening to a day of unusual activity. "Is something special happening today?" Rebecca asked, noticing what sounded like preparations for a significant event. Ayanna's expression grew more serious. "Today our father will hold council to hear your story and decide what role you might play in the future of our people," she explained. "It is not a decision he takes lightly, and the entire village will participate in some way." The idea of being the center of attention for an entire community made Rebecca's stomach tighten with nervousness. She had taught school and was comfortable speaking to groups of children, but addressing a council of Lakota leaders about matters of war and peace was far beyond anything she had ever imagined herself doing. "What should I expect?" Rebecca asked, hoping to prepare herself for whatever ordeal lay ahead. "Honesty," Ayanna replied simply. "Our father can sense deception from across a valley. Speak only truth, even if you think that truth might not serve your interests. Lies always make situations worse, while truth sometimes creates possibilities that no one had imagined." Before Rebecca could ask more questions, the sound of footsteps outside announced a visitor. Dakota's voice called out in Lakota, requesting permission to enter, and Ayanna responded with what sounded like welcome. The chief ducked through the entrance, and Rebecca was struck once again by how his presence seemed to fill the entire space. Despite the generous size of the tipi, he was dressed differently this morning, wearing ceremonial clothing that spoke of formal occasions and serious purposes. His shirt was made of the finest buckskin she had ever seen, decorated with intricate beadwork that told stories in patterns of color and symbol. Around his neck hung a necklace of bear claws and turquoise that clearly marked him as someone of great importance, and his hair was braided with feathers and ornaments that caught the morning light streaming through the smoke hole above. "My father is ready to meet with you," Dakota announced, his formal tone suggesting that this was official business rather than a casual family visit. "Are you prepared to speak with the council?" Rebecca felt her mouth go dry at the prospect, but she nodded anyway. "As prepared as I can be, I suppose." Dakota studied her face for a moment, and she thought she saw something like concern in his dark eyes. "Remember that you are not on trial," he said gently. "You are a guest seeking understanding. Speak from your heart, and trust that wisdom will guide your words." As they prepared to leave the tipi, Ayanna approached Rebecca with a bundle of clothing in her arms. "You should wear these," she said, unfolding what appeared to be a beautiful dress made of soft deerskin and decorated with beadwork in shades of blue and white. "It will show respect for our customs and help you feel more comfortable." Rebecca hesitated, not sure if accepting the clothing would be appropriate or if it might somehow commit her to something she did not yet understand. But looking at the beautiful garment and seeing the genuine kindness in Ayanna's eyes, she decided that showing respect for their customs was more important than maintaining her distance. The dress fit surprisingly well, suggesting that Ayanna had a good eye for sizing. The leather was incredibly soft against her skin, and the beadwork was so intricate that Rebecca could not imagine how many hours of work had gone into creating each pattern. When she looked at herself in the polished metal mirror that Ayanna provided, she was shocked by her transformation. The dress made her look less like a frightened captive and more like someone who belonged in this beautiful, sophisticated world. "You honor our ways," Dakota observed when he saw her in the traditional clothing, and Rebecca thought she heard approval in his voice. As they made their way through the village toward the large, central tipi where the council would be held, Rebecca became aware of the curious but respectful attention she was receiving from the villagers. Children peered around their mothers' skirts to get a look at the white woman in Lakota dress, while adults nodded politely as she passed. No one stared rudely or made hostile gestures, and Rebecca began to understand that word had already spread about her status as a guest rather than a prisoner. The council lodge was even more impressive on the inside than its exterior had suggested. The space was large enough to hold perhaps 100 people, with elaborately painted walls that depicted what appeared to be the entire history of the tribe. Beautiful rugs and furs covered the ground, and a ceremonial fire burned in the center of the space, its smoke rising through an opening that had been engineered with obvious sophistication. Around the edges of the lodge sat perhaps 30 men and women, all dressed in their finest clothing and wearing expressions of serious attention. These were clearly the leaders and elders of the community, people whose wisdom and experience had earned them the right to participate in decisions that would affect the entire tribe. Rebecca felt intimidated by their collective presence, but she also sensed that these were fundamentally good people who would listen fairly to whatever she had to say. At the far end of the lodge, seated on a raised platform covered with magnificent furs and blankets, was a man who could only be Chief Mapi. He appeared to be in his 50s, with silver streaking his long hair and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of both wisdom and sorrow. He was not as physically imposing as his son, but his presence was even more commanding, radiating the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of making difficult decisions and bearing responsibility for the welfare of others. When Map spoke, his voice carried easily across the large space despite its gentle tone. His English was excellent, though heavily accented, and Rebecca realized that he was choosing his words with the care of someone who understood the power of language to build bridges or create barriers. "Welcome to our council lodge, Rebecca Coleman," he said formally. "I am Chief Mop of the Oglala Lakota, and these are the elders and leaders who help guide our people through difficult times. We are honored by your presence and eager to hear your story." Rebecca felt her knees weaken slightly at being the center of so much formal attention, but she managed to remain standing and attempted to respond with dignity equal to what she was being shown. "Thank you for your hospitality, Chief Mop. I am honored to be here, though I confess I am not entirely sure why my story would be of interest to such distinguished people." A murmur of what sounded like approval ran through the assembled council members, and Rebecca realized that her honest acknowledgement of confusion had been the right response. Chief Mop smiled slightly, the first break in his formal demeanor. "Honesty is always of interest to us," he replied. "In times when lies seem easier than truth, we value those who choose difficulty over convenience. Please sit and tell us about your life before yesterday, so that we may understand what forces brought you to our attention." Rebecca settled onto the soft furs that had been arranged for her, aware that every eye in the lodge was focused on her with intense attention. Taking a deep breath to calm her nerves, she began to speak about her childhood in Chicago, her education and work as a teacher, her marriage to James, and their decision to seek a new life on the frontier. As she talked, she became aware that her audience was listening with a quality of attention that she had rarely experienced. These people were not simply waiting for their turn to speak or judging her words against preconceived notions. They were genuinely interested in understanding her perspective and her experiences, approaching her story with the kind of respect usually reserved for sacred texts or important historical accounts. When she reached the events of the previous morning, describing the attack on her settlement and her capture by Dakota's war party, Rebecca found herself struggling to find words that would convey both the terror she had felt and her growing understanding of the complex motivations behind the violence. She spoke carefully about her fear, her confusion, and her gradual realization that her captors were not the savage monsters she had been taught to expect. "And what do you think of us now?" Chief Mop asked when she had finished her account. "After spending time in our village and learning something of our ways?" Rebecca considered the question carefully before responding. "I think I was taught many things that were not true," she said slowly. "I was told that Indian people were uncivilized, but I see a civilization here that is different from mine but no less sophisticated. I was told that your people were violent and cruel, but I have been treated with kindness and respect that many of my own neighbors never showed me." She paused, gathering courage for what she knew would be a difficult truth to voice. "I think both our peoples have been lied to about each other, and those lies have made it easier for others to profit from our conflicts." Another murmur ran through the council, this one carrying a different tone that suggested her words had struck a resonant chord with her listeners. Chief Mop leaned forward slightly, his eyes showing increased interest. "You speak of others who profit from our conflicts," he said. "Can you explain what you mean by that?" Rebecca felt herself stepping onto dangerous ground, but she had committed herself to honesty and would not retreat now. "Land speculators who want Indian territory, open for white settlement," she said. "Arms dealers who sell weapons to both sides. Politicians who build their careers on promises to solve the Indian problem through violence. Newspaper editors who sell more papers with stories of savage attacks than with stories of peaceful cooperation." The silence that followed her words was complete, broken only by the crackling of the ceremonial fire. Rebecca wondered if she had gone too far, if her analysis would be seen as presumptuous from someone who was, after all, a captive in their midst. But when Chief Mop finally spoke, his voice carried approval rather than anger. "You see clearly for someone who has lived so long surrounded by blindness," he observed. "The question now is what you choose to do with that clear sight." Before Rebecca could ask what he meant, an elder woman who had been sitting silently near the chief's platform rose to her feet and began speaking in rapid Lakota. Rebecca could not understand the words, but the tone suggested that something important was being discussed. Other council members began responding, and soon a lively debate was taking place entirely in the native language. Dakota, who had been sitting quietly to one side of the lodge, caught Rebecca's confused expression and leaned closer to provide translation. "Grandmother Winona is telling the council about dreams she has been having," he explained in a low voice. "Dreams of a white woman who would come to us in a time of great change and help our people find a path through the darkness ahead." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine at his words. "Dreams about me specifically?" "Dreams about a woman with golden hair and a teacher's heart who would arrive when we most needed help understanding the white world," Dakota replied. "Grandmother Winona is our most respected visionary. Her dreams usually prove to be prophecies." The debate continued for several more minutes before Chief Mop raised his hand for silence. When he spoke again, his words seemed to carry greater weight than before, as if decisions were being made that would affect far more than just Rebecca's immediate future. "Grandmother Winona's dreams suggest that your arrival among us is not mere chance," he said to Rebecca. "She has seen visions of great changes coming to all the peoples of this land, changes that will require wisdom and courage from both whites and Indians if we are to survive them together." Rebecca felt overwhelmed by the implications of what she was hearing. "I'm just one person," she protested. "I don't have any special powers or knowledge that can help anyone navigate great changes." Sometimes the most important people are those who do not believe they are important. Chief Mop replied with a slight smile. Pride makes people blind to possibilities that humility can see clearly. An older man who had been silent throughout the proceedings suddenly rose and began speaking in Lakota, his tone urgent and concerned. Rebecca could see worried expressions appearing on the faces of several council members as they listened to whatever message he was delivering. "What is it?" Rebecca asked Dakota quietly. "Scouts have returned with news from the outside world," Dakota explained, his own expression growing serious. "A large military force is being assembled at Fort Peterson. The territorial governor has declared that all Lakota bands must report to designated reservations within 30 days or be considered hostile." The news hit the council like a physical blow. Rebecca could see fear, anger, and determination warring in the faces around her as people tried to process the implications of this ultimatum. Everything they had been discussing about potential paths toward peace suddenly seemed far more urgent and far more complex. Chief Mop listened to the complete report before responding, his expression grave but controlled. When he finally spoke, his words were directed toward Rebecca rather than his own people. "It seems that the great changes grandmother Winona foresaw are beginning sooner than we expected," he said quietly. "The question now is whether you are willing to help us face them." "How could I possibly help?" Rebecca asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew part of the answer. "By serving as a bridge between our worlds," Chief Mop replied. "By speaking to your people with the voice of someone who has lived among us and learned that we are not the monsters they believe us to be. By helping us understand the white world well enough to navigate its complexities without losing our souls in the process." Rebecca felt the weight of enormous responsibility settling on her shoulders. "And if I agree to try? What would that mean for my life?" "It would mean choosing a path that has never been walked before," Dakota said, speaking for the first time since the council session had begun. "It would mean living between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, but serving as a connection between both. It would mean facing danger and criticism from people on both sides who benefit from continued conflict." The chief nodded gravely. "My son speaks truly. This would not be an easy path, and we could not promise your safety or success. But we could promise that your efforts would be honored by our people, and that you would always have a home among us, regardless of what happens in the larger world." Rebecca closed her eyes and tried to imagine what such a life would look like. No more quiet domesticity, no more predictable routines, no more safe anonymity. Instead, a life of constant challenge, constant travel between worlds, constant responsibility for issues far larger than any individual should have to bear. But as she opened her eyes and looked around the council lodge at the faces watching her with such hope and trust, Rebecca realized that the alternative was to return to her old life, knowing that she had walked away from the chance to make a real difference in the world. Could she live with herself if she chose personal safety over the possibility of helping to prevent a war that would destroy thousands of innocent lives on both sides? "I would need to know more about what specifically you would want me to do," she said carefully. "And I would need to understand what resources and support would be available to help me succeed." Chief Mop smiled more broadly than she had seen him do before. "Wisdom begins with good questions," he observed. "Let me tell you what we have in mind." For the next hour, the chief and his council outlined a plan that was both audacious and practical. Rebecca would serve as an official ambassador from the Lakota people to the territorial government, carrying messages and proposals for peaceful coexistence. She would also work to establish educational and cultural exchange programs that would help both peoples understand each other better. Most importantly, she would use her position as someone trusted by both sides to identify and counteract the forces that were profiting from continued conflict. The plan would require her to travel extensively, speaking to government officials, newspaper editors, business leaders, and ordinary citizens about the reality of Lakota life and the possibility of peaceful coexistence. She would also need to learn much more about Lakota culture, history, and political structures so that she could represent their interests accurately and effectively. "It sounds incredibly challenging," Rebecca admitted when the presentation was complete, "but also incredibly important. If there's really a chance that this could help prevent a war." "There is always a chance," Chief Mop said firmly. "The question is whether enough people on both sides are willing to work for peace instead of preparing for war." As the formal council session began to wind down, Rebecca found herself thinking about all the factors that would influence her decision. Her husband James, assuming he was still alive, would almost certainly view her work with the Lakota as betrayal. Many of her white neighbors would consider her a traitor for working to protect Indian interests. She would face constant suspicion, criticism, and possibly physical danger from people who preferred simple solutions to complex problems. But she would also have the support of people like Chief Map and his family, individuals who had shown her more genuine respect and kindness in 2 days than some of her neighbors had shown in 2 years. She would be working toward goals that aligned with her deepest values as a teacher and as someone who believed in the fundamental dignity of all people. And she would be using her unique position as someone who had lived in both worlds to build understanding rather than perpetuate ignorance. "I need some time to think about this," Rebecca said finally. "It's a bigger decision than I've ever had to make, and I want to be sure I understand all the implications." "Of course," Chief Mop agreed. "Take whatever time you need. But remember that events in the outside world may not wait for our deliberations. The 30-day ultimatum means that decisions will be made soon, with or without our input." As the council session officially ended and people began filing out of the lodge, Dakota approached Rebecca with an expression that mixed hope and concern in equal measure. "Would you like to walk with me?" he asked quietly. "There are things I would like to show you that might help with your decision." Rebecca nodded, suddenly realizing that she wanted very much to spend time alone with this complex man who had turned her world upside down in ways she was only beginning to understand. They left the council lodge together and walked through the village as the day reached its peak. Dakota showed her the school where Lakota children learned both traditional wisdom and practical skills for dealing with the changing world. He introduced her to craftsmen whose work rivaled anything she had seen in the finest shops of Chicago, and to healers whose knowledge of medicine combined spiritual insight with empirical observation in ways that challenged everything she thought she knew about science and religion. Most importantly, he showed her the cemetery where his mother was buried, a peaceful grove of aspen trees where simple stone markers recorded the names and deeds of those who had passed into the spirit world. Standing beside the grave of the woman who had tried to bridge 2 worlds and died for her efforts, Rebecca finally understood the full weight of what she was being asked to attempt. "Are you afraid that I might meet the same fate she did?" Rebecca asked softly. Dakota was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I am afraid of many things," he said finally. "But mostly I am afraid of what will happen if no one tries to continue the work she began. My mother believed that peace was possible if enough people on both sides were willing to choose understanding over hatred. Her death should have proven that belief wrong, but instead it seems to have made the need for such work even more urgent." As they stood together in the dappled shade of the aspen grove, Rebecca felt something shift inside her heart. Looking at Dakota's face, seeing the pain and hope warring in his dark eyes, she realized that her decision was no longer just about abstract principles or political possibilities. It was about this man who had carried the burden of his mother's death for years, trying to honor her memory while struggling to believe in her vision of peace. "If I choose to do this," Rebecca said quietly, "I won't be doing it alone, will I?" Dakota turned to look at her directly, and Rebecca saw something in his expression that made her heart skip several beats. "No," he said simply. "You would not be alone." The promise in those words carried implications that went far beyond political alliances or practical support. As they walked back toward the village through the golden afternoon light, Rebecca found herself imagining a future that would have been unthinkable just 2 days ago. A future where she and this remarkable man might work together to build the kind of world his mother had dreamed of, where love could grow strong enough to overcome the prejudices and fears that kept their peoples apart. By the time they reached Ayana's tipi, Rebecca had made her decision. The path ahead would be difficult and dangerous, but it was also the only path that offered hope for something better than endless cycles of violence and retribution. That evening, as the village gathered for a feast in her honor, Rebecca Coleman stood before the assembled Lakota people and formally accepted their invitation to serve as an ambassador for peace. The cheers that greeted her announcement echoed across the valley like thunder, carrying with them the hopes and dreams of a people who had waited too long for someone to believe in the possibility of a better world. But as the celebration continued into the night, Rebecca found herself thinking not about the political challenges that lay ahead, but about the way Dakota's eyes had lit up when she made her announcement, and about the quiet promise of partnership that had passed between them in the aspen grove where his mother lay buried. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new responsibilities. But tonight, surrounded by the warmth and acceptance of her new family, Rebecca Coleman felt more at home than she had anywhere since leaving her childhood behind in Illinois. The messenger arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with the weight of urgent news. Rebecca woke to the sound of commotion outside Ayana's tipi, voices speaking in rapid Lakota that carried tones of alarm and preparation. She had grown accustomed to the peaceful rhythms of village life over the past week, and the sudden disruption sent a chill of apprehension through her heart. Ayana was already awake and moving swiftly to dress in traveling clothes rather than her usual morning attire. Her movements were efficient but tense, and Rebecca could see worry etched in the lines around her eyes. "What's happening?" Rebecca asked, sitting up and reaching for the beautiful Lakota dress that had become her daily clothing. "Scouts report that Colonel Henderson is marching from Fort Peterson with 200 soldiers," Ayana replied, her voice tight with controlled fear. "They are 3 days away and moving fast. The messenger says they carry orders to arrest any whites found living with Indian bands and to force immediate compliance with the reservation decree." Rebecca felt her stomach drop as the implications hit her. Colonel Henderson had a reputation throughout the territory as a man who believed that the only good Indian was a dead Indian, and his solutions to frontier problems always involved maximum force applied without regard for civilian casualties. If he was leading the expedition, it meant that negotiations and peaceful solutions were no longer possibilities the military was willing to consider. "Are we evacuating the village?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The women, children, and elders will move to the winter camps in the deep mountains," Ayana confirmed. "But the warriors will remain to defend our ancestral burial grounds. They cannot be moved, and we cannot abandon them to desecration." Rebecca closed her eyes and tried to process the enormity of what was happening. In a matter of days, everything would change. The peaceful village that had become her sanctuary would be transformed into a battleground, and the people who had welcomed her as family would be forced to choose between abandoning their sacred places or fighting a battle they could not possibly win against overwhelming military force. As they hurried to dress and prepare for whatever the day would bring, Rebecca found herself thinking about the terrible irony of the situation. She had accepted the role of ambassador precisely to prevent this kind of confrontation, but events were moving faster than diplomacy could keep pace with. The window for peaceful solutions was closing rapidly, and she wondered if her decision to stay with the Lakota had been naive idealism rather than practical wisdom. Outside the tipi, the Village was transforming before her eyes. Warriors emerged from their lodges carrying weapons and war paint, while women began the practiced routines of emergency evacuation. Children who had been playing games just hours before were now helping to pack essential supplies and round up horses for the journey to safety. The entire community moved with the efficiency of people who had faced such crises before, but Rebecca could see the strain in every face. Chief Moppy stood near the council lodge, surrounded by his war leaders and speaking in urgent tones about defensive strategies and evacuation routes. When he saw Rebecca approaching, he broke away from the group and walked over to meet her, his expression grave but not unfriendly. "I am sorry that your time of learning about our ways must be interrupted by such violence," he said formally. "But perhaps this crisis will teach you more about the realities we face than months of peaceful observation could have done." "What can I do to help?" Rebecca asked, though she felt helpless in the face of such overwhelming military force. Chief Moppy studied her face for a moment, and Rebecca thought she saw approval in his dark eyes. "There may be a way for you to serve the cause of peace even now," he said slowly. "But it would require great courage and the willingness to risk everything for the possibility of preventing bloodshed." Before Rebecca could ask what he meant, Dakota appeared at her side, his face painted for war and his entire demeanor transformed. From the thoughtful man she had come to know into something that reminded her forcefully of the terrifying warrior who had captured her. The change was so dramatic that she actually took a step backward before catching herself. "The scouts report that Colonel Henderson is planning to attack at dawn in 2 days," Dakota said without preamble. "He expects to find us unprepared and demoralized. Instead, he will find warriors ready to die for their homeland." The grim satisfaction in his voice made Rebecca's heart ache. She could see that part of him was actually looking forward to the coming battle, not because he loved violence, but because it would finally provide a clear and simple solution to the complex problems that had been weighing on his soul. Death in battle was honorable and comprehensible in ways that the messy compromises of diplomacy could never be. "There has to be another way," Rebecca said desperately. "If I could reach Colonel Henderson before the attack, if I could convince him to negotiate instead of fight, he would arrest you as a traitor and use your capture as justification for his assault," Chief Mop said bluntly. Colonel Henderson did not march 200 soldiers across difficult terrain because he wanted to talk. Rebecca felt tears of frustration burning behind her eyes. Everything she had worked toward, all the hope and possibility that had grown between her and these people, was about to be destroyed by the kind of mindless violence she had hoped to help prevent. The futility of her position as an ambassador without any real power or authority had never been more apparent. "But there is something else you could do," Dakota said suddenly, his voice carrying a note of reluctant hope. "Something that might change the entire nature of this confrontation." Both Rebecca and Chief Mop turned to look at him with surprise, and Rebecca could see that whatever idea had occurred to him was something he had not discussed with his father beforehand. "If Rebecca were to return to the white settlements as my wife," Dakota said slowly, as if working out the implications as he spoke, "if our marriage became a symbol of alliance between our peoples, it might force Colonel Henderson to reconsider his approach." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Marriage to Dakota was something she had begun to dream about in quiet moments, but she had never imagined it being proposed as a desperate military strategy rather than a declaration of love. The practical nature of the suggestion made her heart sink even as her mind recognized the political wisdom behind it. Chief Mop's eyes widened at his son's proposal, and Rebecca could see him rapidly calculating the political implications. "A marriage alliance," he said thoughtfully. "It has been done before, though not in recent memory. The territorial government would be forced to recognize such a union, and attacking the village where the ceremony took place would become an act of war against a treaty partner rather than a simple police action against hostile Indians. But would it work?" Rebecca asked, though she was not sure whether she hoped the answer would be yes or no. Would Colonel Henderson really hesitate to attack because of a marriage ceremony? If the marriage were properly witnessed and documented, if representatives of the territorial government were present to verify its legitimacy, it would create legal complications that even Henderson could not ignore, Chief Mop replied. At minimum, it would buy us time to negotiate and perhaps find a peaceful solution. Dakota turned to look directly at Rebecca, and she could see vulnerability beneath his war paint that reminded her of the gentle man she had come to care for so deeply. I know this is not how you would want to be asked such a question, he said. Quietly, in better times, I would court you properly and speak of love rather than strategy. But these are not better times, and I must ask whether you would be willing to bind your life to mine in service of peace. Rebecca felt her heart racing as she tried to process the enormous decision being thrust upon her. Marriage to Dakota, under normal circumstances, would have been complicated enough, given the cultural barriers and social pressures they would face. But marriage under these circumstances, with the lives of hundreds of people potentially hanging in the balance, carried responsibilities that terrified her. Yet as she looked into his eyes, she realized that the strategic considerations were not the only factors in her decision. Over the past week, she had grown to admire and care for this remarkable man in ways that went far beyond political alliances. His intelligence, his compassion, his dedication to his people, and his willingness to consider paths other than violence had all combined to create feelings that she had never expected to experience again after losing her first husband. If I say yes, Rebecca said carefully, it won't just be for political reasons. You need to understand that. Something that might have been joy flickered across Dakota's features before he controlled his expression. Nor would it be just political for me, he replied simply. I had hoped to speak of personal feelings at a more appropriate time, but since circumstances forced the issue, I will say that my heart has been yours since the day you chose to care for my people rather than fear them. The declaration hit Rebecca harder than she had expected, flooding her with warmth and hope even in the midst of their desperate situation. Whatever happened with Colonel Henderson and his soldiers, whatever challenges they would face as an interracial couple on the frontier, she knew that the feelings between her and Dakota were real and strong enough to build a life upon. Then, yes, she said simply, I will marry you. The smile that transformed Dakota's painted face was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. For a moment, the approaching crisis seemed less important than the joy and promise contained in that expression. Chief Mop nodded gravely, but Rebecca caught a glimpse of satisfaction in his eyes that suggested the marriage had his complete approval. Then we must move quickly, the chief said, becoming businesslike again. The ceremony must be performed today, and messengers must be sent immediately to Fort Peterson to inform Colonel Henderson of the new situation. With luck, we can force him to halt his advance while the territorial authorities decide how to handle a formal treaty marriage. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity that left Rebecca feeling dizzy with the pace of events. Ayanna took charge of preparing her for the ceremony, producing a wedding dress of incredible beauty that she claimed had been made for her own future marriage but could be adapted for Rebecca. The dress was made of the softest white doeskin Rebecca had ever felt, decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of the union between earth and sky, human love and divine blessing. While Rebecca was being prepared for her wedding, the entire village transformed itself into a ceremonial space. The evacuation preparations were set aside temporarily as people worked to create a celebration worthy of their chief's son and his chosen bride. Beautiful rugs and furs were arranged in the central area of the village, and women began preparing a feast that would demonstrate the wealth and sophistication of Lakota culture to any outside observers who might attend. Most importantly, messengers rode out toward Fort Peterson, carrying formal notification of the marriage alliance and an invitation from military representatives to witness the ceremony. The message was carefully worded to emphasize the legal and diplomatic implications of the union while making it clear that the Lakota people expected their territorial treaty rights to be respected. As the afternoon wore on, Rebecca found herself caught between excitement about her marriage and terror about the larger situation. The ceremony would be beautiful and meaningful, but it would also be taking place under the shadow of potential violence that could destroy everything they were trying to build. The irony of celebrating love and peace while warriors prepared for war was not lost on her. "Are you afraid?" Ayanna asked as she put the finishing touches on Rebecca's appearance. "Terrified," Rebecca admitted honestly. "But not about marrying your brother. About everything else, yes, but not about that." Ayanna smiled warmly and adjusted the feathered ornament in Rebecca's hair. "Good fear and bad fear," she observed. "Good fear keeps you alert and careful. Bad fear makes you hesitate when action is needed. As long as you can tell the difference, you will be fine." The wedding ceremony began at sunset, with the entire village gathered in a great circle around the area where Rebecca and Dakota would exchange vows. Chief Mahab had donned his most elaborate ceremonial clothing and paint, transforming himself into a figure of such dignity and authority that Rebecca could easily understand why his people trusted him with their lives and futures. Dakota had also transformed his appearance, trading his war paint for ceremonial decorations that emphasized his role as a leader and a bridegroom rather than a warrior. He wore a magnificent shirt of white buckskin, decorated with symbols that Ayanna had explained represented courage, wisdom, loyalty, and love. Around his neck hung a necklace of bear claws and turquoise that marked him as the heir to leadership, and his hair was braided with eagle feathers that spoke of honor and spiritual connection. As Rebecca walked toward the center of the circle, supported by Ayanna on one side and an elderly woman who had been introduced as the tribe's most respected healer on the other, she felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. This was not just a personal ceremony, but a political act that could change the course of events for both their peoples. The vows they exchanged were spoken in both English and Lakota, emphasizing the bridging of two worlds that their marriage represented. Chief Mapi spoke about the sacred nature of marriage as a union that created new possibilities for both individuals and communities. He talked about the responsibility that came with love, the obligation to use the strength that grew from partnership in service of others who needed protection and guidance. When it came time for Rebecca and Dakota to speak their personal promises to each other, Rebecca found herself surprised by the depth of emotion that overwhelmed her. Looking into the eyes of this remarkable man who had become so important to her in such a short time, she felt the truth of her feelings flowing out in words she had not planned, but that came from the deepest parts of her heart. "I promise to stand beside you in whatever challenges come," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent circle. "I promise to learn your ways and help you understand mine, to build bridges instead of walls, to choose love over fear, even when fear seems safer. I promise to be your partner in the work of peace, whatever that may cost us." Dakota's response was equally heartfelt and equally political, weaving together personal devotion and public commitment in ways that made their marriage both intimate and universal. "I promise to protect and cherish you as my wife and my partner," he said solemnly. "I promise to honor your wisdom and your courage, to support your work for peace between our peoples, to stand with you against all those who would choose hatred over understanding. I promise to love you with all my heart for all my days, and to build with you a future worthy of the children we hope to raise together." As Chief Ma performed the final blessing that would make them husband and wife in the eyes of both their peoples and the territorial government, Rebecca found herself thinking about the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. A week ago, she had been a lonely widow with little hope for the future. Now she was a married woman with a husband she loved and a mission that could affect the lives of thousands of people. The celebration that followed the ceremony was unlike anything Rebecca had ever experienced. Music and dancing continued late into the night, with performers telling stories through movement and song that seemed to weave the history of the Lakota people together with hopes for their future. Food was abundant and delicious, demonstrating the prosperity and generosity of the community even in the face of approaching danger. But even in the midst of celebration, Rebecca was aware of the warriors who stood guard at the edges of the firelight, watching the horizons for any sign of approaching soldiers. The joy of the wedding was real and deep, but it was shadowed by the knowledge that everything they were celebrating could be destroyed within days. It was near midnight when a commotion at the edge of the village announced the arrival of unexpected guests. Rebecca's heart leaped with hope when she saw that the newcomers wore military uniforms, thinking that perhaps Colonel Henderson had sent representatives to negotiate. But her hope quickly turned to confusion when she realized that the soldiers were not from Fort Peterson but were wearing the insignia of the territorial militia. The leader of the small group was a young lieutenant who introduced himself as Thomas Bradley and explained that he had been sent by the territorial governor to investigate reports of a marriage alliance between the Lakota and a white settler. His manner was respectful but official, and Rebecca could see that he was trying to assess the political implications of what he was witnessing. "I understand that a ceremony has taken place tonight," Lieutenant Bradley said formally to Chief Mop. "The territorial government needs to verify the legitimacy of any such union for legal and diplomatic purposes." Chief Mop nodded gravely and gestured toward Rebecca and Dakota, who stood together near the ceremonial fire still wearing their wedding attire. "My son has married Rebecca Coleman, according to both our customs and the laws of your territory," he said clearly. "The union has been properly witnessed and documented, and creates formal kinship ties between our peoples." Lieutenant Bradley studied Rebecca carefully, and she could see him trying to reconcile her appearance in traditional Lakota wedding dress with whatever preconceptions he had brought with him about white women living among Indians. "Mrs." he began uncertainly. "Mrs. Dakota Coleman," Rebecca replied firmly, using the name she had chosen to reflect both her new marriage and her continuing connection to her own heritage. "And yes, Lieutenant, I entered this marriage of my own free will and with full understanding of its implications." The young officer made careful notes in a leather-bound book, documenting the details of the ceremony and the statements of all parties involved. Rebecca realized that his report would become an official record that could be used to support or challenge the legitimacy of their marriage alliance in any future legal proceedings. "I must also inform you," Lieutenant Bradley continued, "that Colonel Henderson has been ordered to halt his advance pending clarification of the legal status of the situation. The territorial governor wants to avoid any actions that might compromise treaty obligations or create diplomatic complications with Washington." Rebecca felt a flood of relief wash over her at the news. Their desperate gamble had worked, at least temporarily. The marriage had bought them time to negotiate and perhaps find a peaceful solution to the crisis that had seemed inevitable just hours before. But even as she celebrated this small victory, Rebecca knew that the larger challenges still lay ahead. Colonel Henderson would not be happy about having his military operation suspended, and there would be powerful interests working to convince the territorial government that force was still the best solution to the Indian problem. The marriage had changed the political equation, but it had not eliminated the fundamental conflicts that had created the crisis in the first place. As the evening wound down and the wedding guests began to disperse to their homes, Rebecca found herself alone with Dakota for the first time as his wife. They walked together to the tipi that had been prepared for them, decorated with symbols of fertility and blessing that made Rebecca blush despite her happiness. Inside their new home, surrounded by beautiful furnishings and the soft glow of firelight, Rebecca finally had a chance to process the enormity of what had happened. She was married to a man she had known for barely a week, committed to a way of life that was completely foreign to everything she had been raised to expect, and thrust into the center of political conflicts that could determine the fate of both their peoples. "Do you have any regrets?" Dakota asked softly, sitting beside her on the furs that would be their marriage bed. Rebecca considered the question carefully before answering. "About marrying you? No, about the circumstances that forced us to marry." "So quickly?" "Yes. I wish we could have had time to court properly, to learn about each other without the pressure of crises and deadlines." Dakota nodded understandingly. "I wish that too. But perhaps we will have the rest of our lives to discover all the things we would have learned during a normal courtship. If we survive the challenges ahead," Rebecca said quietly, "if we face them together, we will survive." "Them," Dakota replied with quiet conviction. "Alone, each of us was vulnerable. Together, we become something new and stronger." As they settled into their marriage bed, Rebecca found herself thinking about the truth of his words. Her old life as a lonely widow had been safe but ultimately meaningless. Her new life as the wife of a Lakota chief would be dangerous and uncertain, but it would also be filled with purpose and love in ways she had never imagined possible. Outside their teepee, the village settled into the watchful quiet of people who knew that their peaceful celebration was only a temporary respite from larger struggles. But inside their home, in the circle of Dakota's arms, Rebecca Coleman felt more hopeful about the future than she had since her first husband's death. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them as part of something larger and stronger than herself, surrounded by people who had shown her that love could indeed conquer the fears and prejudices that kept the world broken. Tomorrow would bring new negotiations, new crises, new tests of the alliance they had created through their marriage. But tonight, for the first time in years, Rebecca fell asleep feeling truly safe and completely loved, dreaming of a future where the children Dakota had spoken of in his vows might grow up in a world where the color of their skin mattered less than the content of their hearts. Part 5. The Bridge Between Worlds. 6 months had passed since the wedding that changed everything. Rebecca stood on the porch of the newly constructed government building in Helena, watching the bustling territorial capital prepare for another day of commerce and politics. The transformation in her own life seemed almost impossible to believe. As she adjusted the elegant blue dress that marked her status as an official diplomatic representative, the negotiations that had begun with their marriage had evolved into something far more significant than anyone had dared to hope. The territorial government, faced with the legal complexities of the marriage alliance and pressure from Washington to find peaceful solutions to frontier conflicts, had agreed to establish a new model for relations with Indian tribes. Rebecca and Dakota had become the centerpiece of an experiment in cooperative coexistence that was being watched by politicians and policymakers across the nation. Their success had not come easily. The first months of their marriage had been spent traveling constantly between white settlements and Lakota villages, speaking to groups that ranged from hostile to skeptical to cautiously optimistic. Rebecca had learned to ignore the stares and whispered comments that followed her wherever she went, focusing instead on the growing number of people who seemed genuinely interested in hearing about alternative approaches to frontier problems. The breakthrough had come when they successfully mediated a dispute over water rights between a Lakota band and a group of homesteaders near the Yellowstone River. Instead of the usual pattern of escalating threats and eventual violence, both sides had agreed to sit down with Rebecca and Dakota to work out a solution that met everyone's needs. The agreement they negotiated became a model for similar disputes across the territory. Now Rebecca found herself preparing for what might be the most important meeting of her diplomatic career. Senator William Harrison, chairman of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, had come to Montana specifically to evaluate the success of what newspapers were calling the Coleman experiment. His report would determine whether the new approach to Indian relations would be expanded to other territories, or whether traditional military solutions would be reasserted. The irony of her new role was not lost on Rebecca. A year ago, she had been an obscure schoolteacher with no political influence or special knowledge of Indian affairs. Now she was being consulted by senators and territorial governors about policies that would affect the lives of thousands of people. The transformation seemed almost magical, but she knew it had been built on hard work, careful study, and the kind of partnership with Dakota that made both of them stronger and more effective than either could have been alone. Their marriage had grown stronger and deeper with each challenge they faced together. The political necessity that had brought them together had evolved into a love that surprised them both with its intensity and permanence. They had learned to blend their different cultural backgrounds into something new and uniquely their own, creating a household that honored both traditions while building something entirely original. The sound of approaching horses drew Rebecca's attention to the street below, where she could see Dakota returning from his morning meeting with Chief Mop and the other tribal leaders. Even at a distance, she could read the satisfaction in his posture, and she knew that the final piece of their proposal had been approved by the Lakota Council. Dakota had transformed as much as she had over the past months. The angry young warrior who had captured her had evolved into a statesman whose wisdom and diplomatic skills were respected by leaders on both sides of the cultural divide. He had learned to navigate the complex world of territorial politics while never losing sight of his responsibilities to his own people. The balance he had achieved between those competing loyalties was one of the things Rebecca admired most about him. As Dakota climbed the steps to join her on the porch, Rebecca could see the excitement in his dark eyes that meant good news was coming. "The council has agreed to the land exchange proposal," he announced without preamble. "They will cede the mining rights in the northern hills in exchange for guaranteed permanent ownership of the sacred sites and hunting grounds. It is exactly what we hoped for." Rebecca felt a surge of triumph at the news. The land exchange had been the most difficult part of their overall proposal, requiring months of careful negotiation to convince both sides that they could achieve their primary objectives without destroying each other. The Lakota would retain control of the areas most important to their cultural and spiritual life, while white settlers would gain access to mineral resources that could fuel economic development. "Senator Harrison will be pleased," Rebecca said with satisfaction. He was particularly concerned about whether the economic aspects of the agreement would be viable. They entered the building together, walking through corridors lined with maps and documents that represented the new approach to frontier governance they had helped create. Rebecca still marveled at how much the territorial administration had changed since their marriage had forced a reevaluation of traditional policies. The old assumption that conflict between whites and Indians was inevitable had been replaced by a more nuanced understanding of how cooperation could benefit everyone involved. Senator Harrison was waiting in the main conference room, a distinguished man in his 60s whose reputation for fairness and pragmatism had made him one of the most respected voices on Indian policy in Washington. He had spent the past week touring Lakota villages and white settlements, interviewing people affected by the new policies and evaluating their effectiveness firsthand. "Mr. and Mrs. Coleman," the senator said formally as they entered the room, "I understand you have news about the final component of your proposal." Dakota stepped forward and presented the signed agreement from the tribal council, his manner formal but confident. "The Lakota people have approved all aspects of the comprehensive treaty," he announced. "We are prepared to move forward with implementation immediately." Senator Harrison studied the document carefully, occasionally asking questions about specific provisions or implementation details. Rebecca was impressed by his thorough understanding of the issues involved and his genuine interest in making the new approach work effectively. "This is remarkable," the senator said finally. "In 30 years of dealing with Indian affairs, I have never seen a treaty that addressed so many different concerns while maintaining the support of all parties involved." The question now is whether this model can be successfully replicated in other territories. We believe it can, Rebecca replied, but only if there is genuine commitment from both sides to choose cooperation over conflict. The specific details will need to be adapted to local conditions, but the underlying principles are universally applicable. The senator nodded thoughtfully. I am prepared to recommend to Congress that this approach be expanded to other territories on a trial basis. However, I want to be clear about the challenges you will face. There are powerful interests on both sides who profit from continued conflict, and they will work to undermine your success. Rebecca and Dakota exchanged glances, both thinking of the threats and opposition they had already encountered from those who preferred simple solutions to complex problems. Newspaper editors who sold more papers with stories of Indian atrocities than with accounts of successful cooperation. Arms dealers who lost money when peace broke out. Politicians who built their careers on promises to solve frontier problems through force. We understand the challenges, Dakota said simply. But we also understand that the alternative to success is the destruction of both our peoples. That knowledge gives us strength to continue fighting for peace, even when the odds seem impossible. Senator Harrison smiled for the first time during the meeting. I can see why you have been successful. That combination of realism and idealism is exactly what is needed for this kind of work. As the formal meeting concluded and they began discussing implementation timelines and resource requirements, Rebecca found herself thinking about how much her life had changed since that morning when she had been captured during the attack on her settlement. The terrified young widow who had hidden under her kitchen table had been transformed into a confident diplomat who was helping to reshape the relationship between two peoples. But perhaps even more importantly, she had found in Dakota a partner whose love and support had made her capable of achievements she never could have imagined on her own. Their marriage had begun as a desperate political strategy, but it had evolved into something that gave meaning and purpose to every aspect of their lives. Later that afternoon, as they walked together through the streets of Helena, Rebecca noticed how people reacted to their presence. Some still stared with curiosity or disapproval, but many more nodded respectfully or stopped to express their support for the work they were doing. The change in public opinion had been gradual but unmistakable, as more people saw the practical benefits of peaceful cooperation. Do you ever miss your old life? Dakota asked as they paused to watch children playing in a small park. The quieter existence you had before all this began? Rebecca considered the question seriously. Sometimes I miss the simplicity, she admitted, but I would never trade this life for that one. The work we are doing matters in ways I never could have imagined, and I have you as my partner in it. That makes everything worthwhile. Dakota smiled and took her hand in his, a gesture that had once shocked observers but was now accepted as natural and appropriate. I feel the same way. My mother used to say that the spirits sometimes guide us to places we never intended to go because that is where we are most needed. I think she would be proud of what we have accomplished together. As they made their way back to their home, a comfortable house that blended elements of both their cultural traditions, Rebecca thought about the future that stretched ahead of them. The immediate crisis that had brought them together had been resolved, but their real work was just beginning. The success of their model in Montana was only the first step toward creating a new approach to frontier relations that could prevent the kind of violence and injustice that had plagued both peoples for decades. That evening, as they sat by their fireplace reading reports from other territories where similar experiments were being considered, Rebecca felt a familiar movement in her belly that reminded her of another dimension of their success. The child she was carrying would grow up in a world where his or her mixed heritage would be a source of strength rather than shame, where the color of skin mattered less than the content of character. What are you thinking about? Dakota asked, noticing her contemplative mood. About our children, Rebecca replied, placing her hand on her growing belly. about the world they will inherit because of the choices we have made. Dakota moved to sit beside her on the sofa, placing his own hand over hers in a gesture that had become a daily ritual. They will grow up knowing that love is stronger than hatred, that understanding is more powerful than prejudice, that two people who choose to work together can change the world. As if responding to the sound of his father's voice, the baby kicked strongly beneath their joined hands. Rebecca laughed with joy at the sensation, imagining the remarkable person who would soon join their family and inherit the legacy they were creating. 3 years later, Rebecca stood once again on the porch of a government building, this time in Washington, D.C., holding her 2-year-old daughter Emma while watching her husband address a joint session of Congress about the expansion of the cooperative treaties to all Western territories. The little girl had her father's dark eyes and her mother's golden hair, and her very existence represented the success of everything they had worked to achieve. The Coleman experiment had exceeded everyone's expectations. What had begun as a desperate attempt to prevent a single military conflict had grown into a comprehensive new approach to frontier governance that was being studied and copied around the world. The model of cooperation they had pioneered was being adapted for use in Canada, Australia, and other regions where indigenous peoples and colonial settlers struggled to coexist. But perhaps more importantly, their personal success had inspired countless other interracial couples to build bridges between their communities. The love story that had begun with capture and terror had become a symbol of hope for people everywhere, who believed that understanding could triumph over hatred. As Dakota concluded his speech to enthusiastic applause from lawmakers who had once considered him an enemy, Rebecca thought about the words he had spoken during their marriage ceremony about building a future worthy of their children. Looking at Emma's bright, curious face and feeling the movement of the second child she carried, Rebecca knew they had kept that promise. The attack on her settlement that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of a new world where her greatest dreams could become reality. The giant Lakota warrior who had knelt before her in submission to love and truth had become her partner in creating miracles that neither of them could have achieved alone. And as the sun set over the nation's capital, painting the sky in shades of hope and promise, Rebecca Coleman knew that their story was just beginning. Somewhere in the vast territories of the West, other captives were becoming ambassadors, other enemies were becoming lovers, and other bridges were being built between worlds that had once seemed forever separated by fear and misunderstanding. The future belonged to their children and to all the children who would grow up, knowing that the most powerful force in the universe was not hatred or violence, but the simple courage to love across all the boundaries that small minds tried to build between human hearts. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.